and the Middle East, Iran-Arab relations, and the Sunni-Shiite conflict. Uzi is the author of many publications and academic articles and books. And his recent publications are an edited volume on international intervention in local conflicts, and the Yemen Revolution, Civil War, and Unification. His forthcoming book is on state and religions in the era of revolution, the changing face of the 21st century in the Middle East. And Uzi is also emerged, I guess, for a while now, but really as an authoritative voice, not only in the academic world, but also in Israel. He's turned to for advice by policymakers. He's appearing now on a lot of national news shows dealing with the changing or perhaps imploding Middle East. So it's really an honor to have Uzi here with us again this year. And today he is speaking about Israel and the changing Middle East, reflections of a Neo-Antisemitism, part 1. Hello, sir. I'll introduce you. So, I also have the distinct honor of a very longtime friend and professor, Michael Safier, who was my professor and thesis advisor. He was a professor at UCL and did a lot of really important work in economic development and getting countries in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and early 2000s to deal with structural adjustment and poverty in developing countries. And he also was revolutionary in creating a cosmopolitan planning program, getting economists to deal with cultural issues. And because he foresaw the mess that we are now dealing with. So Michael, welcome.
Okay, so good morning. Thanks, Charles, for the very generous introduction, and I'm really pleased to be here and just to share with you some of the main things actually we have in mind in front of this ever-changing Middle East. What I thought we should do, and we decided on having in the first place some introductory remarks as to how to deal with the Middle East in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, and thereafter actually to focus on Israel and its challenges, the challenges it faces actually in the 21st century. So, what I would like actually just to make for a start is a simple diagnosis that is definitely there when we do talk about the Middle East. What happened in the last 7 years was something so dramatically and so, I would say, deeply changed that basically I would dare say that almost all thoughts and tools by which we actually viewed the Middle East in the 20th century were to change. What we are trying to do these days is to bring in some fresh, different understandings by which to better understand the region. So the diagnosis is pretty simple. You cannot use the tools, the thoughts, the themes, the mode of thinking which was implemented in the 20th century in this region while trying to analyze 21st century realities. That is the diagnosis. So basically what we are trying to do is, let's say, bring in a new set of understandings, replacing the former understandings or the former tools, the former thoughts, and make sure before somebody is jumping into solving out the problems, just to make sure that we know what the problems are. And ask ourselves whether we have a fit research agenda by which to measure and understand the problems. So I'll give you actually some 5 keys. The 5th would be Israel. The first 4 are to do with actually the way Israel should cope with the ever-changing challenges. But all in all, the 5 keys are 5 chapters in my already published book, in Hebrew though, but it is being translated into both Arabic and English. It was called Back to the Future, the Middle East in the Aftermath of the Arab Spring. So we are focusing on recent years and try to see actually what happened in the Middle East. Let's start with the first thing, or the first key. The first key can be defined as what we call political culture. It was a common wisdom in the 20th century, while dealing with Arab states in the Middle East, to refer to them as a sort of a one-man show. What do I mean by one-man show? If you have to deal with Libya, if you have to deal with Iraq, if you have to deal with Syria, if you have to deal with Yemen, these states were taken as one-man show because the energy, either political, economic, cultural, or whatever, was to be confined in the hands of the ruler and his entourage, or his extended family. In Arabic it is called Hamullah. So basically, if you were looking at a certain state like Libya or Iraq, what you did more often than not is to focus on the apex of the pyramid, not on the content, the apex of the pyramid. And basically, if you're going to go through the scholarly literature of the 20th century, you would find that the scholarly literature echoed this situation, and most books were titled like that: Libya under Gaddafi, Syria under Hafiz al-Assad. If somebody was pretty creative, he would depict Iraq Saddam Hussein as the Republic of Fear. But basically it was agreed that what we hear is a bunch of dictators, each one of them to a different level, holds a state with an iron fist, and he is corroborated and assisted by his extended family, as we said. And on top of that, we have the armed forces or the security organs. This came to be known as a police state. In Arabic, Dawlat Mukhabarat. Police state where you haven't got the time and the energy to even think of what the people would like to have, because they were not relevant whatsoever to the dynamics of the political equation. Now, just to make a long story short, what the Arab Spring, so-called, managed to do is just to bring in kind of a psychological change where people, one way or the other, first of all, are not afraid anymore. Just simply put. So what was to be broken is the barriers of fear. When people were gathering at the squares, it is Tahrir Square in Egypt, or any other square in Bahrain, in Yemen, in Tunisia, all these were on behalf of the public, challenging the one-time dictator, forcing him, forcing him to resign, or to be ousted, or to be toppled, or even to be assassinated. That for us was a watershed when we are trying to foster our research agenda. Why? Because while in the 20th century, as we said, in accordance with the one-man show notion, we were to focus on the apex of the pyramid. Now, if to describe it in a picturesque way, what happened is that all these apexes, so to speak, were to be cut off, and we were left with the content of the pyramids. Much of the power, with sort of a snowball effect, was to be absorbed by different groups all over the society. It could be NGOs, it could be youth, it could be Islamists, it could be what have you. So we got kind of a power cake that from now on should be analyzed in a totally different way, and what was required is kind of a table or a research table which takes it into account. So from now on, we cannot stick to what the ruler said as if this is the ANZ, as was the case in the 20th century. So we can definitely discern or be sure about he or she who are trying to analyze the Middle East or to analyze situations in the Middle East, when somebody is sticking to the words of the leader as if this is the 100% actually input that should be taken into account, we know that this is kind of a mistake of the 20th century. We know that he is lagging behind. If you are trying actually to have a say about what's going on in the Middle East, show me your ability to infiltrate, to penetrate, and to get closer to the public pulse. And here's the fascinating thing. The main tool by which people actually were gathering in the square, Facebook, Twitter, etc., was to become also our tool by which to measure the rhythm in the region and to get closer to the Arab streets. So, to make a long story short, and to leave you with the new key by which you, without which you are not able actually to analyze Middle Eastern realities, let me put it that way. In my research center, the MDC, the Tel Aviv University, what we have is a bunch of young researchers, PhD students and others, who are Facebooking and Twittering the Middle East in Farsi, in Turkish, in Kurdish, and in Arabic. This is fascinating, because we are there. We don't have to stick to what was said in that paper or the other paper as was done when I was a student. If I would have to follow Syria, the only thing I had is just two papers, Shireen and Jumhuriya. Now we have people talk, and definitely there is an ongoing interaction with Iranians, Arabs, Kurds, Turks, all over the place. People talk, people interact, and this is a totally different opera. So now we have plenty. We have big, of course we have huge data. What we have to do now is to decide how to categorize it, how to read it. But the main thing is, and this is our main key with when it comes to political culture, never try to understand the Middle East by using Western standards. Basically what we are trying to say, and goes in tandem with our discipline, that you can't actually deal with a culture unless you are familiar not only with its language and history, where you have to be very knowledgeable, but also you should translate that into kind of, I would say, working theme with which to imagine how the other is memorizing himself. This is very important in the Middle East, what people have in the back of their minds. And the mistake which had been done here for 200 years was simply put kind of an attempt to implement my beliefs and understandings on the other. As if my belief and understanding should be universalized. Once you are universalizing things or phenomenons, you ignore the I would say the unique flavor and taste of a certain culture. And we can't do that. This is definitely a recipe for what I would call a great mistake. So take it with you. We are, it's just the beginning, the first of the 21st century. The change is so rapid that you can't actually stick to your stand. You have to always accommodate yourself with the changing circumstances. This is a rapid path. Of course, what we are having here in the 21st century is definitely kind of an opening up the gates of information. People are being tempted to many attempts. There is a flow of information, and we know that we have to follow closely on what's going on day by day, because otherwise we're going to lag behind. So this is a very tough challenge. We have to create, and in Israel actually this is something that already was created. First of all, the cyber unit, because we need the people of technology. But again, what we need actually in tandem with that is what I would call cultural translators. And this is what we are making for the future. Cultural translators. So this is the first key. And for better, for worse, actually, Facebook and Twitter and all that stuff became the very tool of expression of many in the Middle East and beyond. And this is definitely relates to our second part of the presentation when it comes to the ramifications of what happened in the Middle East in other parts of the world. Okay, let's move to the second key. And the second key, again, simply put, is the instrumentality of religion in that part of the world called the Middle East. You know, having taught in France, in Italy, here in Britain, in the United States, I always actually debated myself whether I got the conclusion of what makes a difference between a Western mind and, let's say, an Eastern mind. Where the barrier is to be found when I do talk about the Middle East, and my Western audience feels it very difficult to grasp at times when something that I say and I take it for granted. Thereafter, I understood that it was not actually fully absorbed. And having gone time and again through that, I came to the conclusion that when you are dealing with a Western history, so to speak, the chronological layer is pretty, I would say, simple. Religion, at a certain part, was very instrumental in Europe. We can talk about roughly the medieval era. But thereafter, with the era of revolutions, Industrial Revolution, Glorious Revolution, French Revolution, all these revolutions were secular in nature. Well, these revolutions were to marginalize religion. And it is as if, while looking at the rhythm of Western history, you could have said, the more you progress with time, the less religion and tradition and maybe the past are relevant. Again, and think of the 20th century. Think of the end of history of Francis Fukuyama. Think of the notion that the neo-liberal, one would say even in brackets, capitalist ideology won them over. What does that mean? It means that entering the 21st century with globalization, getting closer to the global village, people are going to leave behind their traditions, past uniqueness, culturally speaking, because it is going to be a much more assimilated world, which is going to be ruled and conducted by internationally owned companies and by the language, international language of the computer or the internet. I'm not saying that everybody thought that way, but again, in the margins of that understanding, religion, tradition, was something of more, I would say, kind of a custom of the past that should be respected, that should be introduced, but it is definitely not a pillar around which to build up a state or a society. Now, if you're gonna take this understanding, if let's say, for example, that we are going to use that chronological layer, the Western chronological layer, saying that with the progress of time, secularism is going to, or neoliberal understandings are going to be the most instrumental ideas or ideology. Well, if you're going to put that in the Middle East, paradoxically, after the Arab Spring, the opposite would be true. Simply the opposite would be true. So here comes the oxymoron. A set of upheavals in this region, the Middle East, was depicted by many Western analysts as the Arab Spring. As for them, it heralded the coming to the fore of democracy. You should actually just follow the act of implementation. It happened here, here, and there, in East Europe, what, 30 years ago or something? Now what remains is the Middle East, and thanks God, even the Middle East actually took the right step in the right direction. What we got in the 7 years after that is almost the opposite, not in the sense of bloodshed and civil wars, because this is something that could be definitely traced when it comes to the French Revolution. Nobody says that the day after the downfall of the Bastille, a neoliberal democracy was to be established in France. But what we have here, and this is very, very important, is that forces of the past became stronger than ever before. And I would like actually you to imagine that, because we talked about in the first key, when we said that the bolstered, let's say the blunt dictator was having sort of an iron grip over a certain society. He basically suffocated all dreams, all voices, and we couldn't have the opportunity even to hear the other voices in the 20th century. Because all of them were deaf, basically. No sign, no voice. Now try to imagine what's going on here. First of all, religion in this region proved to be very, very resilient. So what I'm trying to say is, if you're going to give me the separation between state and church, don't come to the Middle East. If you are going to bring in the layer which says, I know how to run a state, I know how to run a society, I'm going actually to provide you with the simplest and most useful understanding by which to separate state and church, that won't work in the Middle East. If you are coming up with that kind of a thing, you're going to dictate sort of a recipe of a civil war. Example, 100 years ago, a guy named Mustafa Kemal Atatürk created modern Turkey. In kind of a blunt step, he broke with tradition in the Middle East, so to speak, because he thought that Turkey should be joined, or Turkey should be on board with New Europe, or secular Europe. And he put it bluntly, saying that religion has taken us captive by its anachronistic shackles, and we cannot actually go on with that. We have to break with religion and tradition. 100 years later on, we have actually the opposite of Atatürk. His name is Erdogan. And what Erdogan is trying to do is to inject religious flavor into nowadays Turkey in order to bolster Turkey when it comes to the power struggle in the region and to create a hegemony for the Turks in the region. You could definitely talk about Iran with those secular Shahs. Shah in Persian is king. The secular king, the secular Shah. Marginalizing religion as if this is sort of a dust in the wind. Well, religion is coming back. But in places where religion was bluntly marginalized, religion is coming up with a backlash or kind of an anti-secular revolution, as was the case in 1979 in Iran when the Ayatollahs came to the fore. So if you don't have the religious layer, you're going to miss something which is very, very important while trying to analyze a certain state. So what is the bone of contention between Sisi, the incumbent in Egypt, and the ousted one, his predecessor, Morsi? If you are coming up with kind of a Machiavellian simplicities, you would say that this is a power struggle, as always is the case. But if you sink in or dig in, you would definitely find that what these two do hold is a different visions on how Egypt should look like in the future. What Morsi vied or opted for is an Islamic republic named Egypt. Sisi respects religion, but wouldn't let religion to become the pillar of the society and the state. Fatah versus Hamas. The ignorant would say both of them are Palestinians. What they are quarreling about, what they are at loggerheads about, is just a power struggle. Nonsense. Hamas and Fatah, though both of them are Palestinians, are fierce enemies. Why? Because they couldn't agree on the future vision, if and when, of the would-be Palestine. Hamas would like to have an Islamic Palestine. Fatah, which is comprised of secularists, would vie for a secular Palestine. Well, in the West, or in the Western academia, there could be definitely food for thought and something through which to compile a great symposium, state and religion. In the Middle East, state and religion is the stuff from which these civil wars are being made. It tears up societies from within. Erdogan versus Kemalists, Fatah versus Hamas, Sisi versus Morsi. Bone of contention is to what extent religion should be instrumental, period. And this is a never-ending story. There is no way to find an ultimate equation or formula by which to accommodate both. Not to mention the coming to the fore of the monster, ISIS, which has nothing to do with a certain territorial state, because ISIS negated nationalism. Because nationalism, a Western phenomenon, is basically damaging your loyalty to your religion, which is Islam. So if I would make a long story short and focus for a moment about this storm called ISIS and try to epitomize this whole experience, I would say that ISIS was using key one, Facebook and internet, in kind of a marvelous and brilliant way, making people all over the world, not only the Middle East Muslims of course, to recite his ideology in one short sentence. The more Iraqi you are, the less Muslim you are. The more Lebanese you are, the less Muslim you are. The more Moroccan you are, the less Muslim you are. The more Palestinian you are, the less Muslim you are. The more French you are, the less Muslim you are. Now, having dealt with that for 4 years, I can tell you that this is a vicious circle. It's unbelievable how youth all over the world were willing to buy this poison, and on behalf of that, slaughtering their neighbors, their co-citizens, and create kind of a different world. I'm saying that because now everybody speaks about the defeat of ISIS. This is a Western notion. What is a defeat? I knew that ISIS had kind of, let's say, basis in Mosul and Raqqa, and this is to be destroyed. So physically speaking, we managed to defeat ISIS. But again, if you take ISIS as sort of an epidemic thing, if you understand that the virus are already there, we may be just in the end of the beginning, we are starting the beginning of the end. So how can we actually develop the antivirus? By more planes going to the Middle East? By more air attacks in the Middle East? You tell me. How are we going to deal with the virus? We know that the virus is going to be dealt with only by educational revolution. Only by other Muslims coming up with an alternative ideology. Here and there you can hear some Muslims do talk about that. But in my opinion, in terms of organization, they are few and far between. They definitely cannot bring in kind of a very systematic alternative. So we are stuck with that. Everybody is going to sell us the merchandise that ISIS is dead. But we're going to have new mutations of ISIS. And then we're going to have some articles coming from academics, neo-ISIS, neo-Salafiyya, neo-Jihadism, neo-that and neo-that. Think of that, because religion, past, tradition, is something which is very, very instrumental in the Middle East. It is much more important, I dare say, than the present. Okay, now let's move to the third item there. Okay, and the third item deals with what I call failed states. Oh, yeah. The third item is failed states. Now, this is the map. This is the map we know, and we definitely use more often than not while dealing with the Middle East. Well, for me, this is a map of the 20th century. I'm not talking about Iran. Where is that? Oh. I'm not talking about Iran. And Iran definitely is a deep culture, deep civilization. thousands of years. The same goes for Egypt, the same goes for Turkey. By the way, if you would like actually to have the Middle East, geopolitically speaking, it is 1, 2, 3, Turks, Persians, and Arabs. Egypt, Turkey, Iran. This is the triangle. But basically what is most important is what happened in the states within the triangle. The content of the triangle. I'm talking about the states which, maybe I should just stand there. Okay.
Which was the third country, Saudi Arabia?
Now, Saudi Arabia is, Saudi Arabia,
Turks, Persians, and
Persians,
Arabs.
Turks, and Arabs.
And which state is the Arab? Egypt.
Well, Arabs is everybody, but Egypt is a deep civilization, so this is why I put it in tandem or in accordance with the Persians and the Turks.
Thank you.
You know, Persians, I mean, we don't have time for that, but just try to think about sort of 3 millennia. 3 millennia. Huge empire. Try to think of the way people memorize themselves. In Persian, actually, it is kind of an idiom called tamaduni bozorg, which is high civilization. Oh, sorry for that. I'll try to okay. Can you follow that? Okay. Here is Iraq. Here is Syria. Here is Jordan. Here is Lebanon. All these states compile what we know in history the Fertile Crescent. It is the crescent which is being stretched from the head of the Persian Gulf to the eastern flank of the Mediterranean. These were byproducts of a British-French concoction in the First World War named Sykes-Picot. What we have 100 years after is that those artificial creatures are being fallen apart. The fascinating thing is that every pre-state ingredient is confining himself in his territorial and cultural slice. To make a long story short, let's talk about, for example, let's take Iraq, for example. This is the Iraq the British actually created in 1921. It was an amalgam of Shiites, Sunnis, Kurds. Kurds, you know, are not Arabs. And Sunnis and Kurds are not Shiites. Now again, to make a long story short, what the British actually had in mind while creating Iraq, of course, it went in tandem with their imperial interests. Because India was there, and India was the jewel in the crown, of course. And I was here in the Public Record Office while gathering some information and material for my PhD. I was sitting in Kew Archives, the archives in Kew, and I was really excited to have a correspondence, February 1921, 1 month before the declaration of independent Iraq. There was a clerk who sent a telegram to Wilson, the High Commissioner in Baghdad, the British Army Wilson, the High Commissioner in Baghdad. I mean, the telegram was something like, what if? What we're gonna do if Shiites gonna go for Sunnis? Kurds for Arabs and vice versa. And I spent 5 days to find actually the response coming from Baghdad, from Arnold Wilson to that clerk of the foreign policy. And I managed to have that 5 days later on. And it went like that. Thank you for the note. How very observant of you. But rest assured, it won't happen here. And what I was very, very excited to find, and I have to just admit that much of my career was built upon that kind of a sentence that Arnold Wilson was to provide the Foreign Office with. It won't happen here since we're gonna teach them to let bygone be bygone. We're gonna engineer their memory. Think of that. What we are going to provide people with is kind of an understanding that what happened hasn't got any relevance when it comes to nowadays. All of them would become Iraqis, leaving behind their primordial identities. The same goes for Syria. This is a French project. The Syrians, actually the French were to create what they call in French Grand Liban, which is Great Lebanon, and then have Syria, which is being comprised on cantons or let's say mini-states or autonomies. Here, up there, Kurds, Alawites, Druze, Shiites, Christians, and the majority Sunnis. Who was to rule Syria? The minority, not the majority. Who was to rule Iraq? The minority, not the majority. So basically, what happened here is kind of the exact recipe for a huge catastrophe sooner or later. The Arab Spring, which was to cut off the dictators, brought in all these demons from the past, primordial identities. They came to be very, very relevant in the 21st century. So, basically, I mean, the world is still using the notions of Syria and Iraq, of course, but practically there is no such a state named Syria. There is no such a state named Iraq. I mean, there is in the UN, of course, but this is something that the world still holds, because otherwise they would have to come up with a set of alternative definitions, which are going actually to clash with geopolitical considerations. So what we got here, let me just show you, let's just merge Iraq and Syria. This is the situation. What this Surakiya map, Surakiya is Syria and Iraq basically, is, it is comprised of ethnic and religious attributes, not national attributes. So if you are going to Hama or Aleppo or Palmyra, are you going to say to yourself that you are going to have a rendezvous with Syrians? That's a mistake. Syrians is something that has to do with the 20th century. If you would like to really grasp the power configurations and have an idea of who is who, you have to differentiate between Sunnis and Shiites, Kurd, Druze, Alawites, etc. So the world is still talking about peace in Syria, peace in Iraq, the spy in the sky, pie in the sky. without having even the basic understanding that you should name people here by their primordial identity. Now, of course, I was really being attacked by so many in the West in the last decades by using this sense of primordial identity, because it was sound for many as kind of essentialistic item. It actually contradicted basic Western understanding. And what we have here, well, in the Middle East is gone.
Not in our part, huh?
Here we go. So let's take this map. Okay, what is that? You can talk about that section and named it Iraq. I'm coming from Tel Aviv University. We had a 2 weeks workshop with many people coming from here. They are Kurds, and the name Iraq is not to be mentioned in front of them. They have their national flag, they have their history actually being flourished once again, and they are that proud to have a referendum next month with which actually to declare independent Kurdistan. Well, I mean, in accordance with that understanding, what we have from Basra, from Baghdad to Basra, is a sort of a Shiistan. It is the Shia government, Shia militia, Shiite army. What we have here is the Kurdistan which used to have in one time Syria. By the way, Kurds have their own map and geography or topography, and they named it Rojava. This is the western part of one time Kurdistan. This is Roj Halat. The one time actually the eastern part, Bashur north, Bakur south. What is that? This is Alawistan. This is the state of the Alawites, Bashar al-Assad, of course being supported by the Russians and the Iranians, but basically what was saved is Little Syria. Here we have the Trump-Putin agreement, southwest Syria. This is the beginning of the redivision of the Middle East, I would say. And of course what is left is what is going to be done with the gray spot. This is ISIS. Mosul is smashed, everybody goes to Raqqa, but until recently everybody was to fight against ISIS because ISIS was kind of a common denominator. With the absence of ISIS, everybody is going to fight everybody for the legacy or the heritage or the territorial vacuum which is going to be left after ISIS. What the notion is, primordial identities, make sure that you understand people in line with their cultural, religious type. This is very, very un-Western or illiberal, I would say, in a way, but basically that's the rule in the Middle East. This is how people identify themselves. So the nationalist formula, at least when it comes to that part of the region, failed to succeed. Failed to amalgamate or assimilate different types of ethnicity and religion and to turn them into, by using melting pot, into kind of a cohesive nation. So are we going to have the map of the 20th century or the unofficial map of the 21st century? That's the question. It would be very, very simple to use the map of the 20th century because it's clean. It tells you where the border lies. But here is the thing, 1 million Muslims were slaughtered in the last decade. In most cases, they were slaughtered by other Muslims. Boundaries have been blurred. In Jordan, what we have is 2 million refugees coming from Syria. In Lebanon, I would say 25% of the Lebanese population nowadays are refugees from Syria. Turkey, 2.5 million, not to mention the flow. Oh, sorry. Just a minute. Not to mention that huge and mass flow of refugees to every other part of the world, especially Western Europe, out of the Middle East, and some other parts of the world. So we are in the midst of a revolution. A revolution that has to do with the way people define themselves, memorize themselves, and we should ask ourselves which vocabulary, socio-demographically speaking, we are going to use. In the Middle East, I'd rather actually name people when it comes to this stage of the third person by their, as I said before, primordial identity and not by the nationality. I think that we'll stick to that just a minute. And let's move to the fourth. 25. Let's move to the fourth key. Okay, now you have a set of primordial identities. You have religion as something which is very important. And you have this phenomenon or the gadgets of the 21st century. So now you can understand why nobody could have imagined what ISIS is. For more than 2 years, ISIS was taken by the Obama administration and by leaders of the West as more of the same, which means Qaeda number 2. But ISIS was an oxymoron that couldn't be traced and followed clearly by the Western eye, because while the body, hands and legs, was to run with actually 21st century devices, especially Facebook and Twitter, the mind was to get inspiration from a different time zone. 7th century. Caliphate, Puritanic Islam, scientifically put, it's Salafism or Salafia Jihadiste. Sorry, I'm saying it in Hebrew. But it's Salafi Jihadi interpretation of Islam. Well, again, we don't have time for that, but you know the Muslim Brothers? Simply put, Muslim Brothers is Salafiyah. Salafiyah is to, yeah, but it is to just follow the Salaf. Sahaba, yeah, and the ancestors. What Qaeda and ISIS actually came up with while building up their industry is not to wait for sort of all people change their mind about what pure Islam is. Just to force pure Islam with jihadi notions, which is a holy war. It's very important actually to understand what happened here when it comes to the last 8 years, and I have to go back to the Obama administration. There were some huge mistakes while dealing with the Middle East when it comes to the West, largely speaking, or the free world, United States and West European leaders. Well, I mean, again, we don't have too much time, but let me just make sure that we understand what happened here. The evil was to show up. On top of ISIS, there was a guy named Bashar al-Assad who used chemical weaponry in order to slaughter his own people. September 2013. Well, history taught us that when evil shows up, you have to nip it in the bud. What happened here is that the United States, even if declared that Bashar is to be toppled because he crossed the red line, and I'm just quoting what John Kerry said, they came up with nothing. And they let the Russians, the good Samaritans of the world, to take care of that. Okay, let's see what we ended up with the termination of the Obama administration. Look at the eastern flank of the Mediterranean. The eastern flank of the Mediterranean is a Russian spot. Yeah. Oh, what is that? Sorry. Okay, here we go. The eastern flank of the Mediterranean is fully, ultimately controlled by the Russians. Don't make mistake about that. The Middle East got another friendly, quote-unquote, generous, quote-unquote, aggressor, without quotes, cynical, without quotes, cruel, without quotes, actually player in the Middle East. Second, Bashar is still there. And what was appeared actually several months ago is not less than that. Bashar is running a crematorium nearby the Sidnaya jail and prison in Damascus. Where the free world is, the whole notion of what free world is was to be emptied from its significance. This is why everybody in the Middle East were to run crazy. Because there is no world anymore. And you can count on nobody. So what you have here is a bunch of bits and pieces. Each one of them is I would say, devoting himself to the art of politics of survival. Shifting alliances. No blocks. Many, many ad hoc alliances. States that were one time part and parcel of the Middle East, Iraq and Syria, which became kind of a theater of no man's lands. I won't name the players because there are too many. But just remember that the Iranians, the cunning and the shrewd player of the Middle East, has managed to capitalize on Obama's naivete, and while he dealt with ISIS, they made sort of a sneaking to the other part of the region, and beneath Russia here, you can find the Revolutionary Guards of Iran. Just here. They have Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hezbollah in Syria, Al-Hashd al-Sha'bi, Hezbollah in Iraq. They have Hezbollah in Yemen, Hezbollah in Afghanistan, Hezbollah in Libya. And they go on and on. And nobody can help it out because they are much, much more clever than anybody else in the Middle East. The problem is that they are shrewd and cunning. But again, this is a nation of 3,000 years. They are well experienced. They know how actually to deceive their negotiator, and they are going all the way to the bank. Now what we have here is who is going to get this pie. Let me just do with you kind of a small exercise. And this small exercise would let you understand that you can talk to people in the Middle East as if it is 2017, but always think of what is the plot which is being run in the back of their mind. Okay, let's take for example, that. So, this is Mosul, this is Raqqa. Okay, one time Iraq and Syria. This is in Hebrew, but it was translated from Turkish, sorry. So I would actually retranslate it into English. This is the words of Erdogan. It is called actually what we do have in our heart. Erdogan says we do respect the physical boundaries. You can see the physical boundaries, but nobody can put limitations to our heart. And when it comes to our heart, Mosul is part of the one-time Ottoman Empire. So if somebody has some plans about Mosul, Raqqa, or whatever, should take into consideration that we are going actually to have a say there. Okay, why? This is kind of a reviving the dream of the Ottoman Empire. So you can be into the 21st century. You can rule Turkey, but what you have in mind is some sultanic ideas and dreams that do correspond with actually Ottoman history. Kurds. Every point here is 1 million Kurds. This is one-time Kurdistan that was to be divided into 4 states: Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. You know the notion now. Kurds remain Kurds. How surprising. Let's take the Iranian. This is in Hebrew, sorry, but this was translated from Arabic. What it is being said here, what is being said here, this is Iran, and listen, pay attention to the orange spot here in Iraq. It is full of Shiites, and it is up northwards of Baghdad, and this is to say that pro-Iranian Shiite militias in Iraq are running a campaign here, heading to Mosul, which is a Sunni stronghold, which was the capital of ISIS. The Iranians are going to liberate Mosul, but thereafter, and I quote what Qais al-Ghazali, one of the commanders of the Shiite militias in Iraq, says, immediately after the conquest of Mosul, we're going to settle the scores with the Sunnis that had committed actually in the year 680 this barbaric massacre against the Shiites. 680. Just 1500 years before. Time is very amorphic here. You don't use clock, Western clock, or Western watch. Things are being, even time and space are being measured in a different way. And this is what we are trying to educate people about. First of all, make sure that you can adjust yourself to the changing circumstances. Now, this brings me, so we have, of course, a plethora of forces, of orientations, let us say, change of the guard when it comes to the superpowers, and this brings me to the fifth key, which is Israel. So where does Israel stand when it comes to that? I thought, Charles, to start with that in the second part, and maybe to leave some 10 minutes or whatever to, is that okay?
Sure.
Oh, okay. Okay, so, yes, please.
Thank you for the lecture. I had two questions. One is now the time for the Kurds to go for a free Kurdistan? Do they have a real chance? I assume that the Turks will do anything to prevent that.
And the Iranians too.
And, okay. And the second question was, what about Saudi Arabia in this game? Thank you.
Okay, first of all, the Kurds, definitely it's high time for the Kurds to declare their independence. I have many Kurdish friends, been to Kurdistan. This is kind of a very courageous nation, proud of its history. There is a referendum next month. I do hope that the Barazani camp, of course there is also some dissensions from within. But here is the thing, when it comes to the Kurds, the main cities, Erbil and others, are being ruled by the Barazani family, and they are opting for Kurdish independence. When it comes to the eastern part of Kurdistan, well, that has been taken by the Iranians already. So there are some Trojan horses in Kurdistan who became kind of Iranian agents. And since the Kurds actually do see eye to eye with all anti-Iranian players in the Middle East, they know that they have been, they should actually have their calculus regarding that in a different manner. Saudi Arabia, well, this is a very, very different story, because this is not a state that was compiled under the maps of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Saudi Arabia. Maybe I should just go back to the map there. Here's Saudi Arabia. Look at this, gigantic in terms of territory. But what happened here, you know, I'll try to make a long story short, is that, you know, the family that was running the places of Mecca and Medina here was to be ousted. This is the Hashemite family. The sons of Faisal and Abdullah were to become the kings of Iraq and Transjordan. Who won them over is the prince of the desert, Ibn Saud, who came from an area called Najd. It is a deserty area in the Arabian Peninsula, and they managed to conquer the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Before that, they managed to conquer from the Ottomans that part of Eastern Arabia, which was to become actually an asset of oil and economic gains. So basically Saudi Arabia is not a monolith in terms of our Shiites, moderate Sunnis, but most of them are very Puritanist, coming from the heart of the desert, following what we call the Wahhabi creed. And basically this is the state which, in order to buy immunity, so to speak, was to actually channel a lot of money to Islamists, including Al-Qaeda, in order to block the Soviets in Afghanistan. So basically, while looking at Saudi Arabia, you can see actually how psychotic this history is, because, I mean, you are doing something by which to solve out the problems you have now in front of your face, but thereafter, in the end of the game, what you thought to be actually the tool by which to solve the problem became a huge problem by itself. And this is the dynamic. So of course we have oil, we have a lot of problems that, but Saudi Arabia is being ruled now by a triumvirate. Salman is the king, but his son, Mohammed bin Salman, is, I would say, a most talented young guy, and he is being assisted by other technocrats, and this is a very, I would say, anti-Iranian, totally different Saudi ruling elite that makes us think that even the Saudis actually glean some lessons from what happened.
So, there are two quick questions, we have like 7 or 8 minutes. I want to push back against your assertion that the Obama administration was naive. And I want to do it in this way. I think that Obama himself and the people that he surrounded himself with, his aides, were very well aware of the Muslim Brotherhood, their ideology. They had, I think, intimate knowledge of it in the United States and internationally. Obama's speech in Cairo, where he invites the Muslim Brotherhood to be honored guests in his speech at the chagrin of Mubarak and the regime, which was a serious move when you're a guest in the country. Clapper's position that the Muslim Brotherhood was this sort of nefarious secular organization, which is outrageous given his position. The fact that the United States consistently aided the Muslim Brotherhood in the elections of the Arab Spring and promoted the Arab Spring and promoted Morsi. The list goes on, and even supporting radicals in the Sunni world and also radicals in the Shia, ultimately. So I think wouldn't history look at the administration as colluding with promoting Islamism in its effort to engage the Muslim world, as they put it?
Well, you know, I mean, this is actually the twilight zone when we can't actually be very assertive on what people really had in mind. So for the sake of our discussion, I put it as kind of a mere naivete, because I think that what Obama had in mind is that all people, these creatures with 2 legs, in accordance with what Immanuel Kant actually was to preach for, that the best thing on earth is human beings, basically. I'll just make a long story short here, of course. And what Obama thought is that actually, you know, every human being has its own ratio or rationale. What I have to do as another human being is to have this click or good interaction with his logic. This is kind of a way by which to universalize things like logic and rationale. It is as if everybody, which is a human being, has the same stuff between the ears. Well, I think that there is kind of a human logic, but it is not necessarily the same in each culture.
Right.
Understandings are totally different when it comes to people who are actually being educated by a different environment, a different history, different experiences, and so on and so forth. And, you know, I know that there are political scientists here, so no offense, actually, no, I'm not, I used to have one of my major was actually political science, but I am totally disagree with those models by which actually to implement my understanding from here and there on the Middle East or vice versa. There's no way you can do it. Of course, there is a place for comparison. Of course, you can do comparative politics, but basically you cannot ignore the specific flavor of this region, and this is something that should be inquired into. Unless we have that in mind, we're going to have some problems with it. And I think that Obama, you know, I mean, look at the Cairo speech. It was just so simple. You know, we're going to have a peace between Israel and Syria. Israel and Syria, that's a piece of cake. Israelis and Palestinians are going to sit together. We're going to actually wrap it up in kind of a way. The only thing that Obama said that he is going to focus on is fighting Al-Qaeda. There was no ISIS there. That's all. And you know, when somebody speaks that way, you're gonna believe that when he says, yes, we can, he knows what he's saying. You know, we have been, 200 years there have been, I mean, this is the second Napoleon Bonaparte in the Middle East. Napoleon Bonaparte was here in 1798 with his mission civilisatrice. This is the byproduct of the French Revolution. And he thought that if we are going actually to give people the ability to govern themselves, local councils, majlises, etc., this is the best thing people could have. And they're going to thank us. The opposite happened when French soldiers actually were drinking alcohol in the squares of Cairo. The opposite happened when French women actually were moving around with, let us say, being dressed up in kind of a unmodest manner. And I beg you to understand that, you know, there are different code of, you know, customs and understandings when it comes to that region, as is the case, I guess, with East Asia or Southeast Asia or Latin America or whatever. But here we have a very tense and very bitter history, and this has to do with what we're going to say actually in the second part of our presentation.
Thank you. Tea and coffee to serve. We'll be back in
Ireland.